Well, welcome back for another video drasha. We're actually beginning at the beginning. We have gone back to the beginning of the Torah, to the first Torah portion in the book of Genesis, which is Bereshit. And you know, this Torah portion, I think one could say, has been the most controversial Torah portion over the centuries. And the reason for that is because of the conflict between science and the Bible, which seems to be involved with this portion because of the creation story, which stands at the beginning of it. Over the centuries, Jewish philosophers have had to contend with scientific views that seem to contradict the Torah. Of course, the scientific view has actually changed over the centuries. The Greeks believed that the world had no beginning. The world had simply always been here. There was no creation. So Greek science, which continued to prevail in the Middle Ages and indeed into the modern period, that was the prevailing scientific view. So someone like Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, he actually dealt with this question. How can you prove which is correct? Was the world created as the Torah claims, or has the world always been here as science claims? Now, science has come around to the view that indeed the world does have a beginning. And in the middle of the 20th century, a theory emerged and became widely accepted of the origins of the universe, which we call the Big Bang Theory. Now, in some ways, of course, this is closer to the view of the Torah because it definitely posits a beginning to the universe. But it certainly doesn't seem to accord in any kind of details with the creation story given in the book of Genesis, which is, after all, a creation that took place over the course of 6 days. So for some, they would argue that science contradicts the Bible, disproves the Bible. I think there are two possible approaches to dealing with this controversy. The first is an approach that is taken by some, particularly some scientists. We had a speaker many years ago in Peoria whose name was Gerald Schroeder. Gerald Schroeder is a PhD in physics from MIT, and he wrote a book called Genesis and the Big Bang. And he argued that if one properly understands science, if one really understands the latest views of the Big Bang Theory, and if one properly understands how to interpret the Torah, that indeed there is no contradiction. As a matter of fact, he claims that the two actually work very well together. Now, I have to tell you, I heard Schroeder speak. I've read at least one of his books. I really am not in a position to explain his views that well, nor am I able to evaluate his scientific offerings. But I'll give you just a little glimpse into the type of argument that he presents. He says the 6 days of creation, of course, were not 6 24-hour days. Now, this, by the way, is not such a radical statement. The idea that a day doesn't have to be a 24-hour period is something that is not an unusual idea. The Bible itself in the Psalms says that 1,000 years are but a day in the sight of God. And of course, even in English, we use the word day sometimes to refer to long eras of time, right? Back in the good old days. Well, what does that mean? Obviously, in some former period of time which may have lasted for a very long time. But Schroeder works this out in a much more thorough and exacting manner. using Einstein's ideas about the relativity of time, so that time is not the same in all places. And he explains that each of the 6 days of creation was actually a very different span of time. The first day of creation lasted something like 8 billion years. The second day of creation, I think he posits, was something like 3 or 4 billion years. And by the 6th day of creation, it lasted approximately 6,000 years. So and then he shows how, if you look at what science explains about the creation of the universe and the evolution of life on Earth, that actually if you fit it into those time spans, it works out very well. So this is an interesting idea. As I've said, I'm not in a position to really evaluate it. Personally, I prefer another approach, which I think comes right out of the Jewish tradition. There was a famous Italian rabbi who lived in the 19th century by the name of Shmuel David Luzzatto, who's called the Shadal, and he wrote a pretty well-known commentary on the Torah. And the very first thing that he says in his commentary is, the Torah is not a science book. The purpose of the Torah is to teach us a way of life that leads to justice and righteousness. That is his view. You know, if we look at the commentary of Rashi, who is certainly the most traditional commentator, Rashi, in his commentary on the creation, says that the Torah does not tell us the order of creation as it actually happened, and he points to certain contradictions in the account. So, according to these Jewish commentators, the book of Genesis, the creation story in our Torah portion, does not even attempt to be a scientific presentation of the creation of the world. So, if so, we can say, so then what is the purpose of these narratives? Why do we have these stories of the creation of the Garden of Eden and the creation of man and so on? Why are these in the Torah? And again, going back to Luzzatto's statement, I think it is because we are supposed to learn from these narratives certain fundamental ideas about the world, about man, and man's place in the world. You know, I think the most important verse in the entire creation story comes with the creation of man, where God says, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." Now, I'm not going to I don't want to get bogged down with the question of why does the Torah say, "Let us make man." I think a simple explanation that many commentators give is that it's the royal we. Right? We have this idea that kings sometimes use the plural we to refer to themselves, and that certainly makes sense, although there are other explanations as well. But the point is this: what this verse tells us, that man or human beings were made in the likeness of God. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that we somehow look like God, because we hold as a fundamental idea that God has no physical form. So how can we be in the image of God? Certainly, this has to mean that somehow we are divine and we are to be like God in our actions. Now, there's an important concept, and this concept can be found both in Christianity and in Judaism, and there's a Latin phrase that is often used for it. It's called imitatio Dei, which means the imitation of God. And the idea is that we are like God by imitating the ways of God. In the Talmud, it says, for instance, just as God is merciful, so shall we be merciful. The idea is that just as God cares for the poor, who God is concerned about the widow, the orphan, the stranger, so should we be concerned with the poor, with the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. That is the way in which we imitate God. That is the way in which we are to be like God. You know, there's an interesting usage of the creation story that we can find in the Mishnah, and I think this gives us some insight, really, into how Judaism understood the importance of the creation story. In the Mishnah, in Tractate Sanhedrin, which is a section of the Mishnah that deals with legal, judicial cases of all sorts, but when they get to the question of capital cases, they stop and deal with how did they exhort the witnesses in a capital case. Because they said, after all, look, in cases that involve monetary issues, if something goes wrong, it can always be fixed. You can always make payment and fix what was wrong in the judicial decision. But in a capital case, someone's life is in the balance, and so they wanted to impress upon the witnesses how important what they were doing is, how important human life is. So they exhorted the witnesses by saying the following. They said, one person was originally created to teach us that he who destroys a single human soul from humankind, it is as if he has destroyed an entire world. And he who saves one soul from humankind, it is as if he has saved an entire world. And then they went on to say that one person was originally created also to make peace in the human race, so that no one can say, my ancestors were greater than your ancestors. And further, they went on to say that one person was created originally because to teach us that human beings make coins out of a die. And every coin that they make is exactly the same as the last one. But God created man from the die of the first person, and every single human being is unique. So here we see a very good example of how the creation story was used in a practical sense, in a way to teach the witnesses in a capital case how serious what they were doing was, how sacred is every single human life.